So the first question I have is from David Law, who is a senior associate with the Security Governance Group, and he asks, what are the prospects for enhancing the economic resources available to the Libyan state? And I believe he means resources in general that can be applied for security sector reform and the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of combatants. So please do ask your questions. We already have a number. And I think I'll now pass the floor on to Fred. Fred, do you have any answers about this resources question?
Okay, well, I mean, again, this is such a broad issue, and it goes to what the previous speakers were saying about removing Libya from this culture of subsidies and a bloated public sector. And unfortunately, this has persisted with payments to the militias, and I just wonder about diverting all these payments and creating a trust fund for small business loans, for scholarships. I mean, these were initiatives that the WAC, I think, rightfully identified um, again, to wean these young men away from the militias and provide economic opportunities, but they have not been operationalized for a variety of reasons. I think first and foremost political issues, and second bureaucratic inertia, really. I'm not an economist, but those are sort of the things that I see. I mean, the resources are there. It's simply a matter of directing them into the right channel. And I think every Libyan that you talk to recognizes this.
Thank you, Fred. I think we'll go on to another question here. This is from Yannick Hingorani at the OECD, and his question is, do Libya's central authorities have an overall political strategy for sharing power and accommodating the interests of the new men in exchange for their cooperation and possible acceptance of oversight and monitoring of their forces? So is there a political strategy for achieving this type of consensus? Where are those efforts going right now in terms of building that political foundation? And now I'll pass on the question to Bob to answer that via audio. Go ahead, Bob.
All right, if there is a overarching national strategy, it's not in evidence. As Mustafa said, there are competing plans and competing strategies on the part of various groups, even down to individual militia brigades. So I would be interested in how Abdul Rahman looks at this, because he has the most immediate seat at the table here. So, but I think that's the missing ingredient. Clearly, it's the overarching strategic plan that we don't have and haven't had since the beginning.
All right, thanks very much, Bob. I'm now going to pass on to Fred. Fred, what are your thoughts on building this political strategy, this to try and coordinate the various actors on a political level, and to create some sort of, or forge some sort of political will, common ground, and consensus?
Well, again, I think that was the intent behind the announcement of the national dialogue by Prime Minister Zaidan, is establishing a national compact, before the constitution is in place, that establishes rules of the road, really, I think, and shared understanding about security behavior, I think, and about the way forward. It's going to be interesting to see how they operationalize that, but I think in principle, it's a sound proposal. Just to piggyback on the last speaker's comments, I mean, yeah, many different political factions, different ministries have had their own proposals for DDR, for SSR. I'll just point out the aborted effort to create a national guard, which in my view theoretically made sense. The idea that you would transition these militias into sort of provincial and local National Guard forces, really, is sort of a holding pen for 2 years while you're standing up the regular army. The idea was to use what's already there. The program, I think, fell victim to political infighting. It was accused of being an Islamist project. And it just goes to show that in the absence of political consensus, any initiative is seen as a zero-sum game. There are factions that see, well, this is my opponent trying to capture this particular institution. I mean, Dr. Mustafa is not here, but the Warriors Affairs Commission, I heard a very prominent Libyan yesterday describe the Warriors Affairs Commission as a project by the Muslim Brotherhood to create their own pool of militia recruits, and this is why that we should not support the Warriors Affairs Commission. So again, the politics of security sector reform, of these programs, of these initiatives, has become so politicized that you absolutely need a national reconciliation, a national dialogue.
Right. Thank you very much, Fred. We have a number of questions that are being asked right now in the discussion board, and so I'd ask any of our presenters to feel free to answer those. I will, however, read out another question that we've received from Christopher Swallow from Swallow Consulting, and he provides first a comment that leads into a question, and I'll just read straight this question that he provides. It's the Gaddafi regime systematically dismantled the state, leaving a vacuum of bureaucratic and administrative skills within government, especially noticeable in the MOD. As Abdul Rahman mentioned, there is a significant issue with the old guard begrudging the entry of the young revolutionaries into the state. Given the old Libyan military had such a startling poor operational record and the difficulties in recruiting that have been discussed, would it be an idea to actively market an alternative new force staffed by experienced officers and internationally supported? So we're talking about does it make sense to create a new force altogether? I think what he's talking about is essentially dispensing with the existing Libyan army itself. So that's the question of Christopher Swallow. Perhaps I'll first go back to Bob and see if he wants to address that question.
The experience of the legacy military, I think, is a sad one in the sense military officers have said that over the years they watched their commands shrink from several thousand, maybe tens of thousands of men down to a few hundred. Gaddafi's strategy was to leave the military in place to continue to pay its salary, but to give it nothing to do. And the result of all that was that the skills and the leadership ability of that force atrophied. Now, if there was political will to actually make the change, then I think the suggestion that Libya move to a new national army, one that is energized and that is filled with new recruits and new officer corps, would be a good one. But once again, there's two things missing. One would be the political will to make this happen, and the other is a strategic plan to make it possible. And starting out with answering the questions: what is the role of the military in Libya? How should it be organized? How should it be composed? What are its equipment needs, et cetera, and then who should train the officer corps, and how should that officer corps be deployed? All of those questions need to get answered before you start to go into creating a new military force. And all of that takes political will and some sort of political process to come to acceptable and legitimate answers.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Fred, I'd like to bring you in on this. Fred, what do you think about the issue of potentially looking at creating an entirely new military force, which Christopher Swallow mentioned?
The facts on the ground is that, you know, the old military is a shell. It's bloated at the senior ranks. They don't have this experience, and meanwhile you've got this reservoir of fighters, of commanders that actually do have real world operational small unit experience. An attempt to do that was made with this National Guard project that I mentioned, but it was of course opposed by the old Army officers who saw it as a parallel army. And I think the problem is I think one of political will. It's also the outside community, as I mentioned. I mean, the United States, foreign governments, we interact with the quote Libyan army, and that means these old officers, and so I think we're sort of perpetuating this. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, revolutions across history have always seen the formation of new military entities. I mean, we can look at the Iranian Revolution, where you had the Shah's army, which was seen as tainted by its association with the old order. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary Guards were established, and there's a similar dynamic in Libya. So you either need to create a new structure, or you need to significantly rebrand the army so that it loses the taint of the Gaddafi era. And I think I've mentioned in my reports, and I think this makes sense, is a pensioning program for some of these senior officers. There's just too many colonels and generals at the top. And some of these militia commanders that had command of 1,000, 2,000 men during the revolution, if they want to join the army, they want a position of command, but there aren't those spaces available for them because the colonels and the generals that are sitting in these offices are clogging it. The general purpose force that I mentioned that Turkey, the British, the Italians, and the U.S. are training is sort of one aspect of a new military force. I mean, it's going to have a new composition. It's going to draw, I think, from the militias. Its intent is to train a new generation of junior and mid-level officers, and it's going to take several years. We know this from the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan, that on average about 7 years to fully stand up a new army. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much, Fred. I think we've got a number of good questions that are now coming through on the discussion board. I'm going to pick up one here, which is, this was a question by, by Alan Davis, who asks, as many attempts at SSR are made difficult because of Western experiences with formal government structures, do you believe there exists the capacity internationally to meaningfully engage and gain the trust of outside militia groups? So essentially, I think what Alan is getting at, and I think this is a very important issue, and this was touched on by Fred and others in their presentations, and I think gets to the heart of the demobilization issue, is what are the potential for hybrid solutions, hybrid security solutions in Libya? So essentially providing a more permanent or semi-permanent role to militia groups, and to incorporate them to a certain degree, or at least create a stronger relationship with the formal security structures, with the state security structures. So I'll start with Abdul, and then I'll go back to Fred. Abdul, you were coming in loud, so hopefully the sound will work. So go ahead, Abdul.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that the reality is, I think there's two aspects of the question. The first is the question of the international capacity. A lot of the successful international experiences over the last 15 to 20 years in DDR have been when the international community has a mandate to coercively integrate and disarm and demobilize. However, I don't think they have successful experiences in other situations. Also, the fact that the Libyan government and the Libyan counterpart is so disorganized, they make very poor counterparts for international bilateral and multilateral SSR projects. And that's exactly what I'm working on now, and that's what I've been working on really since the revolution. So I can say firsthand on several issues, really the shortcomings have been more on our side, whereby the international community have learned quite a few lessons. The second aspect, in terms of getting the militias, as you may say, or the brigades or the quasi-state forces more involved, the reality is that most political parties and actually most members of the General National Congress have a direct or indirect link and sometimes control over armed forces, mainly quasi-state. And therefore you do see this direct link, whereby you have various types of forces, and some of them are politicized, some of them are militarized, but a lot of them are being used as bargaining tools by those who are more politically adept. And this is causing a lot of distortion in the political scene. and it's making it very difficult to be able to kind of get a clear democratic process going, whereby there is this illusion that there is a democratic process. However, it's not a real democratic process.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer, Abdul Rahman. And your sound was excellent there. I think we've sorted that out. So maybe now, I think that was an excellent initial stab at that question. Perhaps now we could pass the floor to Fred. And Fred, what would you contribute on this?
That was an excellent answer. I mean, I completely agree. I mean, the hybrid security structure is already there, and you know, the Libya Shield Forces are in fact the de facto army. The SSCs are in fact the police that are doing major police functions. I mean, if you look at the LSF organizational chart, you know, 12 regional divisions across the country. Technically, there's a formal regular army colonel in charge. But in reality, you know, below that, there's a brigade or revolutionary militia commander. And as Abdul Rahman mentioned, the problem is that these LSF or elements of the LSF and the SSCs are acting politically. I mean, the commander of the Libya Shield 1 division was involved in the siege of the ministries to pressure the political isolation law. So this speaks to this larger problem of the politicization of the security sector, and you know, that for such a hybrid arrangement to work, there has to be these rules of the road established where, you know, you respect the sanctity of elected institutions, you respect the sanctity of the legislature, you respect the sanctity of elected officials, you don't kidnap them. You know, and that, I think perhaps that consensus can be achieved through a national dialogue. I also agree with the point about, you know, that many of these successful SSR programs and training programs have been undertaken with massive troop presence in the country from foreign powers. I mean, Bosnia, Kosovo, and so forth, Iraq. And it just speaks to the idea that in the absence of a partner on the ground, you do need a foreign troop presence. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Fred. You know, I think Bob would like to also contribute to his question. So, Bob, the floor is yours.
The international experience with creating unified security forces has been one that's pointed out the two basic things that are required. One is that individuals enter into the force as individuals and not as groups. There was, in the beginning in Libya, a year and a half ago, an attempt to sign up people for the military and for the police as individuals, but that very quickly broke down under the pressure of events and also the number of people involved. And so militia groups were brought in and signed up as groups. And when that happened, they maintained their loyalty to their existing commanders and command structures, and as we've just heard, increasingly to, you know, successful politicians, and which has added the force of politicizing these groups. And so the second requirement then is a common training program in which people come in as individuals, they're vetted, and then they go into a common training program so that when they emerge, they have bonded with the other people that have been in that training program, see themselves as members of a new force with a common understanding of their roles and missions and a common set of skills. Absent that, we're back, you know, where we were a year ago or so, when massive numbers of people were brought into the security services, but they were brought in groups that were intact and remain to this day.
Thanks, Bob. I think that's a crucial question, and certainly we're going to pick that up in the report for this meeting. I have a good question here from Jonathan Sandy of the African Union. Jonathan's asked a number of questions. I'm sorry, Jonathan, I haven't been able to get all of them. This question he actually addresses to Bob, but I think it applies to all of you, and I'll just read straight from his question. In your attempt at providing, he's saying, Bob, in your attempt at providing strategic advisory support on doctrine development for the new Libyan and army and police, how far did you and Libyan colleagues take into consideration or reflect the AU Common Defense and Security Doctrine, as well as the AU SSR DDR policy framework, especially the importance of linking the future Libyan military force with the concept of the African peace and security architecture? So what I think is important here is what is the role of the African Union in particular, but also Libya's neighbors and regional organizations in Libya's security sector reform, but also dealing with the issue of militias and the proliferation of weapons. So let's bring in that regional perspective. Is the AU, does it have a role? Can it have a role? And what are Libya's neighbors and regional bodies? How are they engaging? So maybe I'll just start where we left off with Bob, but I'm going to ask all of the speakers to contribute on this.
Thank you very much for the question. Unfortunately, the United States Institute of Peace, where I was serving for the last years, is not a implementer of government policy. And so while we were on fact-finding visits and while we were doing research and while we were informing those folks in the U.S. government that were actually involved in implementation, I'm not sure how, whether or not the U.S. government in its initial attempts to provide security assistance actually was cognizant of these various AU provisions and that were mentioned in the question. So I'll just have to let that pass. And perhaps this is one for Abdul Rahman, who would have an inside view on this.
Okay, maybe we can pass the floor now to Abdul Rahman. And just generally speaking, do you see a role for the African Union, but also other neighboring states and other regional bodies that can perhaps contribute to some of these challenges in the contemporary situation? What do you think?
There is definitely a role, and there are certain links and certain issues that we do work quite closely with the African Union and neighboring countries. However, I keep on going back to the same issue as to our capacity. For example, recently over the last few months, we've been doing a lot of work with the African Union on border security. The issue that's happening, for example, with border security, which is one of the main issues that concerns our neighbors, is that the neighboring states are actually being forced to deal with quasi-state and sometimes non-state actors who are performing border security and other security functions along the borders. So therefore, in some cases, the role of the central government in this relationship is sometimes quite minimal, which is quite embarrassing. The other thing is that for example, when I can speak about the border issue, because that's what we're focusing on now, is again the actual number of forces and the strength of forces that are under direct control of central government command is not so much along the regional areas. So most of our neighbors are actually frustrated at our inability to be able to enforce regional agreements and AU agreements. I guess there is a long-term vision in order to be more incorporated with the African Union on defense and security issues, and the United States is also closely involved in that, even from a coordination point of view. As most of you know, a lot of the United States' activities in Africa, including Niger, for example. So I won't go into much more detail, but I hope that answered the question.
Very much. It's very useful. Fred, do you want to add your voice to this?
This is proceeding at the bilateral level, you know, between different states, and I think there has been some attempt by NATO. I think Libya was invited to join the Mediterranean dialogue, but they didn't accept. And so I think much of this, I think, may stem from preference or perhaps inertia on the Libyan side. You know, as was mentioned, I mean, much of this is still at the informal level, especially on border control. You know, as far as neighboring states go, I mean, especially on the Arab side, they all have their particular baggage. I mean, the Algerians are problematic. Um, the Egyptians even more so, especially what's happening domestically in that country. I mean, somebody in the U.S. government had some suggestion about Egyptian advisors helping out the Libyans with their own MOD, and I can't think of a more dangerous thing at this point in time than to model Libyan's military on Egypt's. So again, I think the neighboring issue is a problematic one for a variety of deep historical and political reasons. Thanks.
We've got 10 minutes left now, and so I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll move on to just a couple final polling questions before I just thank our speakers and participants. And that question is, and I know, Abdul Rahman, you were talking just now about the fact that, you know, really within the Libyan government, there's a need to enhance your capacity, the Libyan government's capacity to engage in a lot of these issues. So it's not just about what the international community can provide, but about building that domestic capacity. But if we do look at what is the international role in building that domestic capacity, and more broadly, if we could identify the most important areas where the international community could be supporting Libyan efforts to demobilize militias, to reintegrate militias, and to advance security sector reform, what would they be? What are the most important areas where that there should be focus on? So where should be the international community and the most important donor states be investing their resources? Are they investing it in the right place right now? Should they be investing it in other areas? Should other types of capacities be focused on to build, or are they getting it right now? So perhaps each of you, I'd ask each of the speakers to really give their thoughts on what are the one or two most important areas for the international community to focus on in terms of empowering the Libyan government and giving them the capacity to advance these crucial processes. So maybe since Fred's picture's on the screen already right now, I'll go backwards now and start with Fred. So Fred, go ahead.
Right. Well, again, I think, and I'm sort of speaking from a U.S. perspective here, I think there can be a lot more that the U.S. could do in terms of helping with ministerial reform at the top, with embedding advisors, with MOD restructuring, with advice. I think the issue of the economy should be tackled as well. I think helping them with small business loans, economic restructuring, and then I think finally this general purpose force, if it is configured properly, can, I think, be an important kickstart to some sort of security, because it will help protect government institutions and installations and officials. But again, I think much of this, unfortunately, has to be done by the Libyans themselves and the national dialogue and some sort of consensus that says enough is enough. And we can certainly provide the forum for that and a space, but I think the heavy lifting has to be done by Libyans themselves. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Fred. Appreciate it. Perhaps we can pass the floor now to Bob before we go again to Abdul Rahman. So, Bob, what do you think of this area? Where should the international community be focusing their efforts?
I think for the most immediate and quickest payback on investment, it would be in helping the Libyans get control of their borders, and particularly the border in the south, which is open now and which is in an area where there's tribal conflict, there's jihadi action, and that's the border with Mali, which is a sensitive border. And so just from a practical perspective, Libya has very long borders. Those borders are going to have to be controlled with a mix of technology, modern equipment, and specially trained forces. It also is a situation where at least 3 Libyan government ministries are going to have to work together. The responsibility for immigration, for customs, and for border patrol and control is split between various Libyan government entities. And so there may be some need to constitute a new entity that brings together all of those authorities. But in terms of the international community providing expertise, providing training, providing equipment, and providing technology, that would be a place for a quick payoff, I think. And it would help stop the Libyans, or help the Libyans stop the trafficking of weapons and people and narcotics through their country. Another place is in terms of institutional development, which we've heard, but I think in terms of the Ministry of the Interior, that is a place where we would look to the European Union, which has, after all, interior ministers in their country. It's a fact that the United States really doesn't have an interior ministry in the sense that interior ministries exist in other countries. And so this is a place where we would look to, I think, the European Union, the European police entities to step forward and provide assistance.
Thanks very much, Bob. Let me now, I think I'll then pass the floor now to Abdul Rahman to answer that question, which he's been dealing with, I think, throughout the question period in his presentation. So go ahead.
The international community has an extremely heavy presence in supporting the Libyan government in all aspects, whether it's security or non-security, public sector management, financial management, security sector reform, DDR. The international community is everywhere. There's embedded advisors, there's support missions, there's an EU border assistance mission, there are advisors in every ministry, there are bilateral projects, multilateral projects. Libyan police and military cadets have been trained all over the world. The issue is that a lot of these projects were based on an international analysis, or an international needs analysis, rather than a domestic Libyan needs analysis, whereby neither really have had the capacity over the last 2 years to correctly diagnose and identify the real issues. What ended up happening is that they were dealing in some cases with Libyan officials that were not really there for a long time, but had their own personal views on what the issue was, that wasn't really based on a correct collection and analysis of information from the ground, because the Libyan government had a very limited presence on the ground. They were just a central government that were almost, in some cases, disconnected from the reality. A lot of the security sector reform and DDR projects this year and for the next possibly 1 or 2 years were decided in conferences such as the London and Paris meetings. Now these meetings, what they did is that they suggested and created new mechanisms for the management of national security priorities. They included the formation of entities such as the National Security Council, National Security Advisor's Office, the managing of interministerial coordination through the use of interministerial working groups, and these covered a range of issues. And the international community is kind of at the door. What they're not doing now, they're willing to do, and there is direct contact at all levels. However, the coordination on our side still needs a lot of work, and that's one of the things that I've been working on and really struggling with for quite a long time now. However, things are slowly moving forward, but it needs much more effort than it should do if it was in any other environment. So in terms of the international community's priorities, there is a Rome meeting which was supposed to be in December, but it's now going to be probably in February, which is a discussion between all the relevant stakeholders, international community, and the main donors as to what was the progress from the last meeting and what is the plan for the next 12 months. So really what we're trying to do now is to have a Libyan needs analysis whereby we can correctly be honest with ourselves about what the requirements are and how we can link that with the international community's capabilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Abdul Rahman. So I'd like to thank our speakers, to thank Abdul Rahman Al-Ajeli, Fred Weary, and Mustafa Al-Sagazli, as well as Bob Perito. Your remarks were insightful, I think very useful for this discussion, informative, and I think gives us some ideas on the way forward, which we'll try and capture in our conference report. I think this was a very useful session for me. I hope all of you found it equally useful. We had, we had a full house for this event, and we're very pleased with how it progressed. So take the opportunity to answer these questions, and I'd like to thank you all once again for taking part, and very special thanks to our presenters.